The year is 1998. Somebody's always trying to ice skate uphill. This is Blade.
For thousands of years, they have existed among us.
You keep your eyes open. They're everywhere. Chances are you've seen them yourself and didn't know it.
A secret nation.
Our livelihood depends on our ability to blend in.
With a lust for power.
We should be ruling the humans. These people are our food.
They've got their claws into everything. Politics, finance, real estate. There's a war going on out there. He makes the weapons. I use them.
Now, one will lead them to conquer mankind.
Tonight, the age of man comes to an end.
We're gonna be gods.
And one will try to stop him dead.
There are worse things out tonight than vampires.
Like what?
Like me.
Half human.
Blade's mother was attacked by a vampire while she was pregnant.
Half immortal.
You got the best of both worlds. All our strengths, none of our weaknesses.
He is their greatest fear and our only hope.
It's open season on all vampires.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Random Rewatch on Movie Punditry. This is Mike, and I am with you today for Stephen Norrington's 1998 film Blade, starring Wesley Snipes, Kris Kristofferson. This is based on a 1973 anti-hero comic called The Tombs of Dracula. Blade was introduced in Tombs of Dracula number 10. He was created by Marv Wolfman and Gene Colan. Originally, Blade was just a regular human who happened to be immune to the effects of vampire bites. But as the comic would progress, he gradually came into become what is known as a Dhampir, which is a hybrid between humans and vampires. So he's part vampire, part human. Originally, his weapons in the comic was he had teakwood knives and mahogany stakes. Those would evolve. The stakes would turn into silver. And then he wound up with this double-bladed sword and the glaives that we see in the movie, which are, I believe they're like acid-treated, which makes them particularly effective against vampires. This was not the first attempt to get Blade into theaters. Originally, New World Pictures had bought the rights to Marvel Comics, and they were going to make a cheap film that was set in Mexico, starring Richard Roundtree, who audiences will remember as John Shaft. Marvel Studios started to develop the film in the early 90s, and their plan was to have LL Cool J play the lead role. That kicked around for a while, and then eventually it was set up at 20th Century Fox. David Goyer was working on the script. Now, the earlier versions of the script were kind of going to be like a spoof film, like a light comedy spoof film, which were really big at the time, coming out of the 80s and into the 90s. You know, movies like Airplane, like Police Squad, like Hot Shots, Top Secret, Scary Movie, those kind of movies. This was going to be something along those lines, but Goyer wanted it to take on a more serious tone. Originally, Ernest Dickinson was set up to direct. He was a guy who was a cinematographer for a lot of pretty decent things through the 80s and 90s. Had directed a couple of movies really nobody ever saw. David Fincher was attached to it for a while, and he worked on the script with Goyer. I can't even imagine what a David Fincher version of Blade would be. It would actually probably be pretty awesome. Goyer and Fincher eventually talked the studio out of this stupid spoof movie thing. Some people in the studio even wanted Blade to be white, which is crazy. It was really Goyer who kind of focused on taking this down a serious road and treating vampirism as if it were like a biological condition or disease or some kind of, spreadable mutation. He did not want a vampire like you would have seen in Interview with a Vampire, that kind of tragic, romantic figure. He wanted it more gritty, more grounded in reality. He was more interested in like a, From Dusk Till Dawn type of thing going on. Now, right about the same time, Wesley Snipes was working with Marvel. He was trying to get a Black Panther movie off the ground. That didn't work out, but eventually he drifted towards this project. And Snipes also served as a producer, and he wanted to make this kind of, he liked the idea of the serious, grounded, gritty kind of take that Goyer was taking, but he wanted it to also be kind of almost more Shakespearean in its tone, like kind of more of a King Lear type situation. And so he worked on the script with Goyer as well. There were some other actors that were considered. Denzel Washington, who had turned it down, he didn't want to do it. Lawrence Fishburne was also considered for it, but Snipes was really always going to be the guy once he had joined the project. Stephen Norrington was eventually brought in. This is a guy with an interesting career, an interestingly short career. He had done one other film as a director, a film in '94 called Death Machine, and he comes in, he does Blade, he does another film called The Last Minute, and then in 2003 he does The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. He had actually turned down doing the Blade sequel in order to do The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. That was the last film he directed. That was 2003. Apparently, the experience of directing that film and its nightmare production was just too much for him, and he wound up never directing another film. He's been circling around a couple of other projects. He was going to do a Crow reboot for a while. Supposedly, there's a couple of different projects he's been circling around, but he's never wound up doing anything else. Norrington wanted to bring in Patrick McGoogan from the TV series The Prisoner as Whistler. He was a big fan. That didn't work out. John Voight was also looked at, but eventually the role went to Kris Kristofferson. So this film was shot largely, actually it was shot almost exclusively in Los Angeles. There was an abandoned Redken shampoo factory that was used for various locations. Think about Whistler's Lair. Think about where the rave was. Think about where Pearl was. It was kind of a big thing to do in this period of time in the 90s, was find some abandoned, industrial works and shoot your movie there. There were a bunch of reshoots. We'll talk about that maybe in a little bit. They reshot the ending. They completely actually changed it after some test screenings, and they did a bunch of reshoots. But other than that, this thing went by fairly smoothly. So that's about it on the pre-production. All right, so let's get into Blade. So we see this little vignette at the front. The subtitle tells us it's 1967. We see a pregnant woman. She is attacked by a vampire. She goes into premature labor. Doctors are unable to save her, but they do manage to save the baby. That's it. We have Blade's origin story. In, out, easy peasy, 2 minutes, and this is a great opening. It doesn't tell us any more than we need to know. It doesn't short us on information that we need to know going forward. We don't need 50 minutes of exposition to tell us why Blade is the Daywalker and why he can do all these things. We're going to get that as we get through the movie, but this is just a quick, here's your setup, here's your person, here's your main character, in and out, and now let's move on to our main story. So we wind up with the sequence in the beginning where we're at this rave club in a warehouse in Los Angeles, and there is this iconic music, which, if you were in the 90s, you heard this music, you knew exactly where it came from. You could still look on Spotify today and still find Blade rave dance mixes and Blade rave playlists from the various musical pieces that are in this movie and the sequels. But this original one from the original rave is it's so classic. Music in the film is done by Mark Isham. He did the score, and then there's a bunch of other pieces by a lot of R&B and hip hop artists in the soundtrack. So there's a lot of music in this. If you are a big TV fan, you may recognize heat-seeking Dennis getting dragged into the club as Kenny Johnson. He's currently on Chicago Fire or SWAT. He was on both of those. He was in Pensacola Wings of Gold. He was Lemansky in The Shield. He was Kozik in Sons of Anarchy. The guy's been on a billion TV shows. This is one of his early roles. The woman who is dragging him in may be a little less familiar to modern audiences, but this was actually in 1998. This was a bit of stunt casting. This is Tracy Lords. She was a adult film star in the late 80s. She was famous because all of her adult films, except one, were made when she was underage. She lied about her age. Producers didn't care. They didn't check. She did a bunch of films. Then she turned 18. Then she got out. And then she tried to go mainstream. And she actually wound up doing a bunch of stuff. She went to acting school. She studied at the Lee Strasberg School. So this is who we're basically opening the main part of the film with. You get this rave and everything's dancing. Everybody's going on. And then all of a sudden, things start to go really weird. There's blood coming from the sprinklers in the ceiling. Everybody's soaked in blood. Heat-seeking Dennis is freaking out. And then you come across this guy crawling on the floor, and all of a sudden, he comes across a perfectly clean boot and pants. And we look up, and this is our introduction to Blade. So you have this great kind of extended fight scene that goes on for a little bit. It starts in the main room, goes off into this other room. Quinn, who's played by Donald Logue, gets his hands cut off. Blade is using his spikes and he's using his sword. He uses his glaive. Part of this fight, you're starting to see that Blade is not this super dead serious character. He, when he whips out his glaive, he's got a little bit of a smile on his face. After he kills a bunch of guys, he does a fist pump. He's always got a lot of wisecracks, and this is, we talked about in Spider-Man, we talked about how there were really 3 films that were kind of the seminal modern comic book movies. Spider-Man, before that, X-Men, and before that, this film. This film really kind of kicks it off. There had been comic book adaptations. There was a terrible Captain America movie. There was a bunch of other really, really bad movies. There were some decent ones. You had, the Tim Burton Batman movies. Unfortunately, you also had the Joel Schumacher Batman movies. You had Superman 78, which was a great film. We did that film at the end of last year. You should check out that episode. It's really, it's a fantastic film. But in terms of like a modern, grounded in reality, grounded in somewhat pseudoscience, sarcastic, quipping, violent superheroes, anti-heroes that is very typical of films that you see today, this is really kind of where that whole thing got started, is this film right here. Blade is, he is not your typical superhero. He is not a great guy. He is definitely what you would refer to as an anti-hero, but he is one of these guys who you're gravitated towards him anyway. He's interesting to watch. Wesley Snipes is fantastic as this character. It's like he was born to play this character. I mean, no shade to Mahershala Ali. He's a great, great actor. And I'm sure if his Blade movie ever gets made, he'll be really great in it. And I will be there opening weekend to watch it. But Wesley Snipes was born to play this role. He does such a great job in it. His background as a martial artist, his confidence as an actor, his charisma on the screen. He really, really takes off and does such a great job with this film, leading this film. He's absolutely fantastic. And he really kind of sets the tone for what we're going to see as the modern comic book superhero, especially the bad boys, the guys in the vein of like Tony Stark, Stephen Strange even, Daredevil, those types of characters. So we wind up with the vampires getting taken to the hospital by the police. We see one character is killed, Dr. Curtis Webb, who is played by the Major from the Iron Man movie. The other doctor, conveniently, is a hematologist, Karen Jensen, played by NBushe Wright. She is our female lead in the movie, and now we're kind of off and running. She gets bitten Blade takes her to his warehouse where Abraham Whistler is, played by Kris Kristofferson. If there's one fault in this movie, I would say it's that there's an abundance of exposition. There's a lot of Blade and Whistler sitting down and just talking to Karen and just telling her how things are. I mean, some of that is great when, Blade is telling her that she doesn't live in the real world.
You better wake up. The world you live in is just a sugar-coated topping. There is another world beneath it, the real world. And if you want to survive it, you better learn to pull the trigger.
Wait a minute. I'm coming with you.
You're useless.
I have to stick with you. It's the only way that I'll stay alive long enough to find a cure for myself.
There is no cure.
But a lot of it is just them sitting there and explaining to her, and it's understandable. I mean, this is a complicated world. You have this whole fight between the true blood vampires and the vampires who've been assimilated, for lack of a better term. The vampires, the old true blood vampires who've been alive for hundreds of years and have their fingers into every aspect of society. They control businesses, they control government, and they want to keep things on the down low, and they want to just be very careful about who knows who they are, versus these new blood vampires who are not living this great lifestyle. And this becomes a story of the haves and the have-nots, right? Even though they're vampires, this is about this younger generation coming up and looking at their elders and going, well, those guys have got all the money, they've got all the power, they've got all the resources, and we're out here literally parking cars at night, working in diners, and we are just as powerful as they are. Why are we hiding in the shadows? We should be out there. We should be ruling the world. There's none of this coexistence garbage. We should be out there in charge. I know people talk about X-Men is an analogy for civil rights, whether it's people being marginalized because of their sexual identity or because of their racial identity. There's a lot of analysis that's been drawn comparing, for instance, Magneto to Malcolm X and Charles Xavier to Martin Luther King, and those are apt, and I agree with those 100%. I think you've got a little bit of that in here. Deacon Frost is kind of the Malcolm X character, where he's like, no, there's no coexistence. We're superior, and we need to live our lives the way that we want to live them. And Dragonetti and his cabal are more on the Martin Luther King side, where it's like, no, this needs to be about equilibrium and coexistence and finding a way to work together with the humans so that we benefit from it. And Frost and his people, they don't want any part of that. They just want to be like, look, we're stronger, we're tougher, we eat them. They are our food. Why are we making deals with them? So anyway, there's a lot of exposition that Whistler and Blade are giving to Karen right up front, including talking about how, some stuff is garbage, but vampires do have weaknesses. Sunlight, silver, garlic. That's what they use against them. You get this scene of Blade having to take this serum to reduce his cravings for blood because he is a part vampire. He's craving blood, but he does not want to drink the blood. And so they develop this serum for him, but his body is becoming immune to it and tolerating it. So he needs to have more and more. And eventually he's worried that he's going to lose that battle. They tell Karen she should leave the city because she's been bitten by a vampire. So now she's marked and they'll be able to find her. Because apparently all the vampires are in LA, I guess. Obviously, she doesn't do that because we wouldn't have a movie if she did. Fortunately, though, as I mentioned before, Karen is a hematologist. She does study blood. And so she starts looking at vampire blood in Whistler's lab. And she finds out that a very commonly available anticoagulant, EDTA, makes vampire blood explode. Cool. I guess you can see where that's going. We have our weapon. So before we get much further, I want to talk a little bit about Blade and specifically his look. As I mentioned before, when we first see Blade in the opening, he is perfectly clean. There's not a drop of blood on him. There's not a spot on him. His boots are on the ground. The guy looks at him, and he's absolutely spotless. And he's got this clean, efficient look. The vest with the armor in it, the trench coat, the boots, the pants, his weapons, the way his weapons are organized on his belt. And then he's got that slot in the back of his trench coat that the katana goes into with the holster in the back of his vest. And it is just really an amazing look. And I got to wonder, how much this affected things going forward. This movie comes out a year before The Matrix. The Matrix is in at least pre-production, if not production, when this film comes out. Blade started its filming in Los Angeles in February of 1997, well, probably before The Matrix started its filming. And I'm not saying that The Matrix copied it, but the aesthetic, especially of Neo in The Matrix, is really similar to the aesthetic of Blade. And I can't really think of a lot of films before that had that similar type of aesthetic. And, Hollywood's a small town, and people talk, and people know each other, and people work on multiple projects. So I'm just wondering if there was at least a little bit of influence, a little bit of like, oh, they're doing that, we should take a look at it type of thing. Clearly, the fighting is incredible. Wesley Snipes is he's a martial arts practitioner. He put his all into these fights. Him fighting in that trench coat is crazy. I mean, it doesn't take much to get that thing hung up on something, to get caught on another person. Just swinging that thing around is really impressive, the way that he's doing it and the way that he moves and the power that he portrays on the screen. A lot of times you see these martial artists fight on the screen, and because they're pulling their punches, because they're intentionally missing each other, sometimes they don't really translate the power. Snipes being an actor first and bringing all of that into it, I think he does an amazing job translating that power onto something in the screen that speaks to the way these fights are choreographed. So let's talk about Quinn. Donald Logue is one of these actors who just brings it every time he comes in. He steals the scene. He's the guy that you remember. He's got a lot of great quips. They wrote a lot of great lines for him in this, and he really kind of pulls it off. He's just fun to watch. You never know what he's going to say. Even when he gets, his hands cut off or whatever, he's like, hey, they're new hands or they're growing back. He's just an interesting character, and he adds a lot of flavor, I think, to the whole vampire contingent. And I think he kind of offsets Deacon a little bit. Deacon is so serious. I mean, yeah, he's sarcastic. He's got his quips that he gets in, especially when he's dealing with Dragonetti. But on the other hand, he's very focused. He's like kind of the ultimate 90s villain. The way he's dressed, the way his hair looks, just a whole Stephen Dorff thing. He's really a guy who fits into this type of movie and as the villain. And Quinn is like this kind of offset for him. He's not as good looking. He's kind of goofy, but he's always got something to say. He doesn't have his eyes set on some greater agenda unless Deacon Frost tells him he does. And he's just out there just trying to get stuff done, just trying to live his life like a lot of these vampires are. And he just brings a lot of fun to the screen. So good for Donald Logue. I gotta kind of wonder what the plan was. What exactly is Deacon Frost's plan here? I mean, I know he's got this kind of generational angst with, the older vampires, the whole, idea of the True Bloods versus the new vampires, that they're considered to be an underclass, that they don't get a share of the wealth that the True Bloods seem to be commanding. The True Bloods have all this power. They have all these familiars who are working with them behind the scenes. They have part of the police department. They have part of the government. They're invested in business, and they seem to be living the good life. Obviously, they don't want to upset the apple cart because they have it going good. The new vampires are looking at them like, why is it them and not us? What really separates us? At one point, their ancestors were absorbed as vampires, and just because they were born as vampires doesn't mean that they don't have humans in their bloodline somewhere down the road. That leads to, Frost is like, oh, we're going to do this whole thing where we're going to bring the blood god down. And originally, in the original script, Frost was supposed to become the blood god. They kind of, I think they maybe even shot that, and it tested really poorly. So that's when they put that final fight in between Deacon Frost and Blade. But I'm just wondering what his plan is. It's like, so you're going to kill all of the old vampires. You're going to kill all of humanity. Like, are you guys going to run the world now? I mean, one, humanity is your food, so you're going to need to keep a bunch of them around. It's like you're eliminating them, but you'll have some of them hanging around. And I guess originally there was, like, literally in the script, there was an explanation of the plan where they were going to, keep a bunch of humans around as basically harvest for food, as a food harvest. Kind of like in the Matrix, they keep us around for the universe's most inefficient batteries. And I think in one of the scenes you can even see that there are, like, body bags in the back. So they planned on, like, growing humans like food stock, I guess. But, if the movies have taught you anything, it's that you leave a few humans around, like Zion in the Matrix, they're gonna rise up and there's gonna be a problem. I just don't think Deacon Frost thought it all the way through. Like, are these guys gonna run the water plant and the power station? Like, how are they gonna live their lives if they get rid of everybody who is already running the world? I don't know that he's really completely thought everything through. We also definitely need to talk about Pearl. So Pearl is the morbidly obese, to say it lightly, computer hacker who lives in a basement and sits naked, I guess. And they come in and they torture him with an ultraviolet light to burn his skin. I gotta think that there's a better way to do that kind of exposition. It seems to be unnecessary. It seems to be somebody, had this bright idea and they were like, oh, hey, let's try this out. Let's storyboard this and see how it works. And then they got to build the thing. And I don't know. It just didn't work for me. I really need to question whether that whole sequence was necessary. Like, they could have done some level of him finding something in a library or writing somewhere and 15 seconds of dialogue and we're out and we understand about the blood god and all this stuff. I just don't really think that whole Pearl section was necessary. I guess maybe it's supposed to show that Karen is kind of leaning over to the dark side because she's, like, so giddy about torturing Pearl, but I don't know. I feel that it could have been they just put that in as I wonder if that's like a leftover from David Lynch, like if that's just some kind of gross kind of shock value thing that they put in there. I just thought it kind of detracted from the movie a little bit. The CGI in this film, obviously very dated. Not terribly so, but there's still a lot of practical stuff in here, like the blood rave. That whole section at the end with the drop of blood running down and starting the ceremony at the end, that part looks really dated. Like, you could really see that there's some bad compositing in there. And fluid effects, liquids, they weren't really anything at this point in time. It would take another few years before they really kind of become effective and filmmakers can do believable, flowing liquids. I'm going to give it a pass. I mean, it is 1998. Like I said, I don't think it's terrible. It doesn't take you out of the movie. It's so bad. But it is, if you sit on especially like on a rewatch, it is kind of noticeable that, like, oh, this is not great. It's better than a lot of other stuff at the time. What I do really like about this film is the whole world building of it. I'm a sucker for world building in a film. I love when filmmakers build out their universe and then put their story in it, whether they're expanding on something that existed. Like, I really like The Bourne Legacy, not because I think it's like a superior action film to the Matt Damon films, but I do like the way they built out the whole universe in that film, where they talked about, Treadstone and Blackbriar, they're just a small part of a much larger picture. I like the world building in this film. I like this whole idea of how he describes it in the beginning of the film, that there's, a world underneath the world that you see, and it exists, and vampires are there, and they're kind of pulling the strings and controlling a lot of the stuff. It's very, Machiavellian, and it's very interesting to see the way they're building this whole thing out, and that there's a culture within the vampires more than the Anne Rice kind of stuff, where it's just like there's these individual tragic heroes. It's like, no, these guys they got corporations, and they've got a board of directors, and they've got people running it, and they've got their hooks into the economy and into society in a way that we never would have imagined, and that is completely visible to most people. They seem to insinuate that it's like in New York, but I got to imagine it's probably in more places. And I know they build out some of that stuff a little more in Blade 2 and in Blade Trinity, but I really like the way they placed it here, that it's just, this idea of, there's a lot more to this than you would see and than the people see, and it's insidious, and it's really, the vampire community has got its hooks into all of the human community. I just found that part to be really interesting, and I really like when that happens in a movie. As I said at the end, there was this thing where like Deacon Frost was supposed to become or merge with the Blood God, and La Magra was going to not even become like a physical form. It was going to be like a whirlpool, like a giant whirlpool of blood or something like that, and Blade is supposed to fight that. And this is what didn't test very well with audiences. It's like, why is he fighting like a whirlpool of blood? So they went back and they reshot, and they worked out the fight at the end between Deacon Frost and Blade. And I think I didn't obviously see the other ending, but I think it sounded awful. This sounds like a much better ending. That other ending sounded like an 80s ending. This sounds like a much better, grounded, it makes sense kind of ending. It's a good start for this, as I said, this important film in terms of the comic book superhero film genre. This is really a seminal film, and to have it end on a dumb note would have kind of really not been great. The other thing is obviously the quips and the little sarcastic remarks. This is a very modern one, and I think Blade probably did it a little bit better than, say, X-Men.
Do you know what happens to a toad when it's struck by lightning? The same thing that happens to everything else.
There's that great line at the end about ice skating uphill. I have no idea what it means, but man, does it sound badass when Wesley Snipes says it.
Some motherfuckers are always trying to ice skate uphill.
And obviously they're setting us up for, with all this world building, they're setting us up for sequels, which we did get, to varying degrees of success. I don't particularly mind Blade 2. Blade Trinity's kind of a rough watch. I mean, maybe we'll do those if we land on those years. Yeah, so that's Blade. So the film had a $45 million budget. It wound up with $60 million domestically and $71 million internationally for a box office run of $131.2 million. Marvel got paid a flat fee of $25,000 to license the character. I don't know who negotiated that deal. Then this film had a huge run on VHS and DVD and Blu-ray, 4K, all the physical medias. It was on cable a lot. It was on premium movie channels a lot. This film got a lot of play. It's got a 59 on Rotten Tomatoes. I don't know what's wrong with people. This film is not a 59. I mean, it's not a 90, but this film should be maybe in the 70s somewhere. I mean, certainly certified fresh, up in there. The audience score is 78%, so that's a little better. But it's 55%. 55% on 103 reviews. That's awful. Metacritic, it's got a 47. It's an A- on CinemaScore. So audiences appreciated this film a lot more than critics did. Roger Ebert, 3 out of 4 stars. He said that Blade is a movie that relishes high visual style, uses extreme camera angles, bizarre costumes and sets, exaggerated shadows. the confident cutting between long shots and extreme close-ups. It slams ahead in pure visceral imagery. Yeah, Raj, it absolutely does. This film was edited by Paul Rubel. He would go on and work with Michael Mann a lot. He did Collateral, Miami Vice, Public Enemies. He would work with Michael Bay a lot. He did a couple of the Transformers movies, The Island. He would work with Peter Berg in Hancock. He did some editing on the Avengers, and he worked on Fate of the Furious. So and Bumblebee, which I love Bumblebee. So yeah, this film's got some really good DNA in its editing. Paul Rubel is well known for his ability to cut action sequences and keep us interested and grounded and focused and give them a sense of time and geography. So yeah, this film is really, really well edited. No Oscars here, but it did win Saturn Awards for Best Horror Film and Best Makeup. Deacon Frost, Steve Dorff got nominated. Steve Dorff won for Best Villain at the MTV Awards that year. This was a time when the MTV Movie Awards were actually a really big deal. Not so much anymore. It also was nominated for Best Fight. It led to video games. It led to, as we talked about, sequels. There is supposedly somewhere in the production is a remake currently on the schedule for November of 2025. Obviously, as we know, it's starring Mahershala Ali. I mean, I love Mahershala Ali as much as I think, as I said, that Wesley Snipes was really born to be this character. You know, if you're going to take a kind of more modern actor, Mahershala Ali is probably the guy. Yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward to that. There's been a lot of trouble with this production. Originally, Bassam Tariq was directing it, and he dropped out, and then Jan Dimanche stepped in, and he's working on it. But as of last month, June 2024, he dropped out. So right now, the film doesn't have a director. So it's also had a big bunch of writers. I think there's 4 or 5 writers have gone through on this thing. Kevin Feige is still out there talking it up. A couple of days ago, he was saying, oh, yeah, it's important not to rush it. We got to get it right. He did hint that the film would be an R-rated film, which seems to suit the character. I don't know. We'll see if we actually see it by the end of next year or not. But that is Blade 1998. Thank you for listening. Our next year is going to be 1990, so I'm looking through the list for there. Continue to check the channel for Green and Black. We have our House of Dragons recap with Justin and I. Main show's coming up. Rendell and I are working on a couple of things. We have our shorts on our YouTube channel. We thank you for listening. Take care and don't try to ice skate uphill.